Got the diary bumping. Party! It's 10th Party Congress, which didn't really have a bit of a party feel. In fact, I've come dressed appropriately. That's better. Righty. Okay, so significance of the 10th Party Congress is what we're going to have a little bit of a chat about, and also highlight some themes from the 1920s, the NEP era, particularly the political things rather than the economic stuff. Okay, so 1920s, after 1921, we see a liberalizing, an opening up of the economy in Soviet Russia. Lenin argued it was a return to state capitalism, so a mixed economy, which had elements of capitalist and free market aspects to it. Now, while that was going on, while Lenin was willing to compromise and open up the economy, he was not willing to tolerate a liberalization, a granting of greater freedoms politically. And part of the context to this was the Greens uprisings, which were seen as a really considerable challenge. And the other thing too was the Kronstadt uprising, which is a really critical challenge. And finally, so Greens movements are underway, Kronstadt's on like Donkey Kong, and then you've got the introduction of the NEP, and it's all happening at the 10th Party Congress. Okay, 8th to the 16th of March. Noting that this begins the day after the assault on Kronstadt begins. So that provides a real atmosphere that it's really tense. It's happening within a context of conflict and great concern. Now, Lenin was having a very hard time getting the NEP through. That there were many in the party who objected to this move away from a more explicitly socialist structure that war communism represented. So, getting them to take on the NEP, as one contemporary observer said, it was like getting them to drink bitter medicine, but they had to take it. Alrighty, now what made the 10th Party Congress more critical was that there was opposition, what you call platforms, groups within the party emerged also at the 10th Party Congress. There were two platforms, basically, two groups. First of all, there was the workers' opposition, which was the more influential and outspoken of these. The workers' opposition, its chief spokesperson, was Alexandra Kollontai, who was a very gifted public speaker, very assertive person who could certainly articulate, the things that she wanted to get across. And she also had Alexander Shlapnikov, who was the leading Bolshevik in Petrograd during the February Revolution, and everybody knows Shlapnikov, da. Anyway, don't worry about that. Okay, so what are we talking about? Workers' opposition. Cool. The objections that the workers' opposition raised at the 10th Party Congress were twofold. Firstly, that they argued that the party had been becoming overly bureaucratic, overly concerned with procedures, with paperwork, and had lost its democratic flavour. And in doing so, it had lost its connections to the proletariat, to the working class. The workers' opposition to workers is the key little thing there. Also wanted a greater opportunity for workers to have a say in the economy and they do so through trade unions. They objected to the NEP as what they saw as a surrender to the peasantry. So they're part of the people who talked about a new exploitation of the proletariat. The other leading opposition platform were the democratic centralists, and what they objected to was similar to the workers' opposition, but they were more emphasising the lack of opportunities for discussion and democratic debate within the party, that they felt that the Politburo was overly dominant over lower levels of the party. All right, so that popped up. A crisis for Lenin, how to deal with this. Lenin responds quite strongly, arguing that, on a quote from Lenin, "Comrades, this is no time to have an opposition. Either you're on this side or on the other, but then your weapon must be a gun and not an opposition." So Lenin was essentially saying that now, in March 1921, was the worst time to come out as an opposition factional group within the party. That then, as they were introducing the NEP, as Kronstadt was, being dealt with, and while the Greens revolts were bubbling away, the party needed to present a united front. If they were going to retreat, they needed to do so in a disciplined manner. Otherwise, this would lead to potentially their defeat and would be undermining them. That while they needed to hold the line, essentially, or as Lenin would say, needed to pull your head in. Okay, after much debate and with Lenin's forceful personality, the oppositions withdraw their platforms basically and agreed to dissolve. Importantly, two decrees are passed. The first one is a really wordy one. It's called On the Anarcho-Syndicalist Deviation, okay, which is basically saying that Lenin was criticizing the theory that underpinned some of the platforms. The more important one was the decree on party unity, and this imposed a ban on factions in the future. And if a communists could raise individual objections to various policies and ask questions, but if they organised formally a platform, that could get you kicked out of the party. This will be the means by which Stalin will come to dominate the Communist Party and the Soviet state into the future. Okie dokie. Other aspects to this. So discipline is tightened up within the party. So that's one theme, and that comes out of the Tenth Partaaayyy Congress. The other element of the Tenth Partaaayyy Congress, just as a reminder, is that the NEP is introduced. Alrighty then. Menskeviks and SRs. So politically, more broadly, further repression is introduced into the 1920s. Formal bans on the Menskeviks and SRs had been lifted during the Civil War, and many Menskeviks and SRs had come to join the government, were serving the Soviet state. This is overturned after 1921 when Menskeviks and SRs are blamed for the strikes that were part of the cause of the Kronstadt uprising. More than 2,000 Menskeviks are arrested following the 10th Partaaayyy Congress. Most leading revolutionaries, so the leaders of those parties, flee overseas or go into exile, like Yuri Martov and others. The SR leadership, some of them are arrested in 1922 and are put on what's called a show trial. And Stalin would be later infamous for this, but the very first show trials happen under Lenin's leadership, and the SRs are the targets of this. Okay, the Greens. So Lenin had described the Greens, the peasant rebels, as more dangerous than all the Udinichs, Denikins, and Kolchaks combined. And so what happens to the Greens? They're crushed mercilessly. With the Civil War winding up, there's now the opportunity to exert all those resources, or the Red Army basically, and greater numbers of Chekists to deal with the Green rebellions under Makhno and Antonov. So rebel areas are absolutely flooded with Red Army troops and Chekists. So more than 50,000 soldiers are deployed against Makhno's troops in Tambov. Okay, and similarly, Antonov, Alexander Antonov's rebels are similarly suppressed. General Tukhachevsky, who was one of the leading military commanders of the Red Army, so was put in command of these campaigns. So they've put in charge somebody who was very effective as the military commander, but they also used political commissars to great effect, who were put in charge of suppressing the support for the Greens amongst the civilian population by quite harsh means, essentially doing things like holding families hostage, holding whole villages hostage. Very effective, surrounding a village, putting everybody up to gunpoint, taking a young man, like 12, a boy, 12 years old, sending him off. All right, go find your uncles, go find dad, go find your brothers, tell them they have to be here, okay, by tomorrow morning, or everyone's going to die. Run. Tended to work rather effectively. One of the challenges that the Green Armies presented was their effective use of guerrilla warfare, and that meant that they were very mobile and quick, and and relied on horseback, and they knew the territory, the local terrain very well. The Soviet forces addressed this by doing things like pumping poison gas into forests, using air power to monitor roving groups of horsemen. So all those advantages were undermined, and by towards late 1921, the green movements are suppressed. Intellectuals don't have such a good time either.
You know the old saying, hasty and frail never fail.
No, not really. Okay, so 1922, Lenin directs Dzerzhinsky to investigate uh, the ways in which what he called counter-revolutionary ideas and values are being propagated, spread by in intellectual circles, so through their magazines, their journals, their lectures, their meetings. Great. By September that year, more hundreds of them had been arrested. Okay, being accused as being counter-revolutionaries. Many of them are thrown into prison camps. Some are executed, like the poet Nikolai Gumilev, who was a literary great, and his case was advocated by Maxim Gorky, who appealed directly to Dzerzhinsky and Lenin, but it was too late. Gumilev was executed. Thousands also of intellectuals, philosophers, musicians, writers, artists, musicians leave Soviet Russia in despair. They can't feel that they can no longer live under such conditions, and so an incredible migration of Russia's intellectual elite occurs in the early 1920s. It was called the philosophers' ships, as which took people from Russia to continental Europe, places like Paris, France, and elsewhere. Alrighty, it's not really lucky actually, it's just last theme, is the evolution of the Cheka. So 1922, the Cheka changes its name. It's replaced by the State Political Administration, or GPU. And isn't that boring? And it was purposely more boring, more bland, more beige, a bit less red than the Cheka. Right. So thinking back to the nature of the name of the Cheka, the extraordinary All-Russian commission into combating counter-revolution, speculation, and sabotage. But the extraordinary bit, the outside the law element, was what was abandoned. The GPU, the State Political Administration, was representing a more legal, permanent approach. The GPU is further made further permanent. It's recognised on the same level as a commissariat a year later in 1923, and then it's called the OGPU. It's a slight change in name. It becomes the United State Political Administration. What's changed? And that's a very interesting element. So we're dealing with that idea of continuity and change then. Dzerzhinsky, Iron Felix, heads both the OGPU and the Cheka. So the boss is the same. Many Chekists continue to be employees, so their name changes slightly as to their job title, but essentially they're still Chekists. The headquarters still is at the Lubyanka building. All right, no longer extraordinary. Now a permanent institution of the Soviet state. Some of the tactics and strategies that the OGP use are different to the Cheka. They're no longer as openly, publicly terrifying. They use surveillance, what's called agent provocateurs, which is essentially like placing spies into organizations, into workplaces. People who would say provocative things like, "So, what do you think of Lenin here? Does he suck? Do you like him? What do you think?" And when someone would go, "Yeah, I don't like him," well, then they would be arrested. Acting more in a way that you'd say was like espionage. So, watching people, infiltrating organizations. They became far bigger as well. The punishments, though, tended to lead. They still executed people, but more people tended to be imprisoned into labour camps. All right, so that's a difference. That's those strategies you might say were far more similar to the Okrana, but the Cheka slash OGPU is different to the Okrana. It's a political police force, but it's far larger. The Okrana had 15,000 staff, where the Cheka had 100,000 staff. You could chuck in another 160,000 if you include what's called their frontier troops, which were technically employees of the Cheka. In the last years of the Tsarist regimes under Nicholas, 14,000 people were executed, whereas the Cheka executed 140,000. So it's substantially more, isn't it? Or even another additional 140,000 on top of that if you include those who were killed in the suppressions of the Greens movements and things like Kronstadt and in the Civil War. So what we have then is an example of continuity and change. And I like this quote by historian George Leggett, who is an expert on the Cheka. The Cheka continued a long Tsarist political police tradition, but differed quantitatively and qualitatively from its immediate predecessor. Same, but different. All right, that was a good party, wasn't it? Till next time, that's svidanya.